He walked like he owned the whole block because technically he did. Every cracked window, every rusted pipe, every apartment with a missing doorknob, it all led back to him. Martin Reddick wasn't just a landlord. He was the landlord. The type that wore a suit even when stepping over puddles of rat water. The kind who didn't knock, just entered. And today, he was in no mood. Apartment 3B was 2 months behind. He had a folder under his arm with eviction papers ready to go. No grace period, no excuses. Rent was due yesterday, and Martin had no interest in charity cases. Especially not in this building, the one he'd been thinking of gutting for condos. He climbed the creaky steps, shoes clicking on the warped wood. A busted light bulb flickered overhead. From the hallway, he could already smell mildew and burnt fabric. He hated coming here. But he liked watching people squirm when he handed them that notice. He reached the door. Faded green paint, peeling like dry skin. He didn't bother knocking, just turned the knob and walked in like he always did. What he saw stopped him cold. A girl, maybe 9, dark curls stuck to her face, shirt faded into the same color as her skin from layers of dust and sweat. She sat on an ancient sewing machine, her little legs barely reaching the pedal. Her hands worked fast, stitching fabric with an intensity that didn't match her age. Martin opened his mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't look up, just kept sewing. Click, click, click. The needle punched through the fabric like it was on a mission. And for the first time in a long time, Martin didn't feel like the most powerful man in the room. He felt small. This wasn't what he expected. He came to evict a problem. But what he found was a little girl too busy surviving to even notice him. The door creaked shut behind him, but the girl still didn't flinch. No greeting, no fear, just focus. Martin stood there for a beat, his hand still on the knob, suddenly unsure of what to do with it. He looked around the room and it hit him. This wasn't just poverty. This was survival, stitched together with scraps. The apartment was barely more than 4 walls and a prayer. A cracked window was sealed shut with plastic and duct tape. The wallpaper, what was left of it, curled like old parchment. A single mattress lay in the corner on the floor. No sheets, just a threadbare blanket folded neatly at the edge. There was no dining table, no TV, no lights on, despite the hour. And yet, the hum of that old sewing machine filled the space like a heartbeat. Martin took a step forward, careful not to trip on the tangle of fabric sprawled across the floor. The whole room was scattered with scraps, old jeans, worn-out shirts, even pieces of curtains cut into patterns. It was chaos, but it had a purpose. Every inch was being used. Every corner had a job to do. He muttered something, maybe a hello, maybe a question, but the girl finally looked up. Just for a second. And that second was enough. Her eyes were dark, heavy, like someone twice her age. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her expression, calm, not scared, not angry, just tired. Martin cleared his throat, trying to reassert himself. "Is your mother home?" he asked. The girl didn't stop sewing. She shook her head, barely glancing at him. "She's working." There was no shame in her voice, no apology. She didn't even ask why he was there. It was like she already knew, like she'd seen men like him before. He glanced again at the sewing machine. It had to be at least 50 years old, and yet she was working it like she'd been born behind it. He stepped into the next room, drawn by instinct. The bathroom light didn't work. The kitchen faucet dripped. The fridge buzzed, nearly empty except for a jug of water and some stale bread. Everything about this place said they weren't supposed to still be here, that someone should have called social services, or maybe the fire department. But no one had. No one cared. Until now. Martin returned to the main room, but he didn't speak. He just watched. The man who once bragged about never giving extensions was now stunned, and maybe even a little ashamed. She wasn't just sewing clothes. She was stitching together a life that the world had already tried to tear apart. And the crazy part? She was doing it better than most adults he knew. Martin had seen a lot of things in his years, as a landlord: drug busts, squatter fights, even a guy who tried to barbecue a squirrel in his bathtub. But nothing stuck with him like the sight of this little girl's sleeves rolled up, face unbothered, fingers moving like a machine, like this was normal. He stepped closer and noticed her hands. Not soft, not childlike, calloused, rough. The kind of hands that didn't just play, they worked hard. Her fingernails were chipped, stained with thread dye and dust. Her knuckles were darkened, probably from rubbing against fabric for too long. These were the hands of someone who didn't have time to be 9 years old. And she didn't seem to care who knew it. Martin leaned slightly forward. "What are you sewing?" Still focused on the machine, she answered flatly, "Pants." "For school?" he asked, trying to place her in some familiar category. A student, a kid playing dress-up, anything to help him make sense of this. "No," she said, eyes still locked on the cloth. "For money." Martin blinked. "For money?" he repeated, like he didn't hear her right. She nodded once. "People in the building pay me to fix their stuff. Sometimes my mom brings me fabric from the hotel she cleans." He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. He didn't even know what to say. 9 years old, repairing clothes for grown people, running a one-girl business out of a crumbling apartment. He watched her guide the fabric through the machine with precision. No wasted movements, no hesitation. The pedals squeaked every few seconds, but she didn't react to the sound. It was just part of the rhythm. Like breathing. That's when it really hit him. She wasn't helping her mother survive. She was part of the survival plan, an equal partner, maybe even the backbone. He scanned the room again and started to notice details he'd missed before. A makeshift pin cushion made from an old sock, spools of thread stacked inside a broken cereal box, a calendar on the wall with little red X's marking off days. Not school days, not birthdays, paydays, rent due, electricity cut, mom's next shift. This was a war zone disguised as an apartment. And the girl? She was the soldier no one noticed. Martin didn't say anything else. He just watched, quietly, as she reached for another patch of fabric. No complaints, no whining, just silent determination. And for the first time, in a long time, Martin Reddick, the man who prided himself on being untouchable, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. He came in expecting to find a tenant avoiding responsibility. Instead, he found a child doing everything in her power to hold her world together with a needle and thread. And somehow, that needle had pierced something in him too. Martin finally broke the silence, but his voice didn't carry the sharpness it usually did. "Where's your dad?" The girl paused for a second. It was the first time she stopped sewing. She looked up, not angry, not sad, just blank, like she'd already answered that question too many times. "He left when I was little," she said quietly. Then, with a slight shrug, she added, "Mom says we don't wait for people who don't want to be found." There was no bitterness, no dramatic pause for sympathy, just facts, like she was reading from a manual on how to survive childhood when you've got nothing but your mom and an old sewing machine. Martin shifted on his feet. "And your mom?" he asked, trying to ground himself in some version of normal. "She's at work," the girl replied, pulling the pant leg from under the presser foot and flipping it over to check the seam. "Double shift today." Martin glanced at his watch, even though he already knew what time it was. Just past 6, which meant her mother had probably been gone since dawn. "Do you go to school?" he asked, grasping for something. Anything, to justify the weight pressing on his chest. She gave a tiny nod. "Usually, but sometimes I stay home when we're behind." That last word hit like a slap. Behind. Behind on rent. Behind on bills. Behind on life. Then, as if sensing his thoughts, she added, "But it's okay. My mom says we only stay until Friday. Then we'll leave. She's trying to find somewhere cheaper." Martin froze. "Leave?" "Yeah," she said, still focused on stitching the hem. "We knew it was coming. We're just trying to hold on long enough for her to get paid." Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't well up. If anything, it was Martin who felt unsteady. "Do you know how much your mom owes?" he asked, voice low now. The girl didn't even look up this time. $923. He blinked. That was the exact number on the file under his arm. She'd memorized it, like it was burned into her brain. "She says once we leave, she doesn't want to owe anyone anything," she added, finally folding the finished pants and stacking them neatly on a pile next to the machine. Martin stared at that pile. It wasn't just clothes. It was rent money, grocery money, hope, stitched seam by seam. He didn't know what disturbed him more, that she wasn't surprised by eviction, or that she'd already accepted it like weather. This wasn't a home. It was a countdown clock. He looked down at the papers in his hand, the ones he used to carry, like a badge of pride, and for the first time, they felt heavy. Like maybe he wasn't the one doing the evicting anymore. Maybe he was the one being pushed out of something. Pushed out of his own cold detachment. Martin walked out of the apartment like he'd just seen a ghost. The eviction notice stayed, tucked under his arm, untouched. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure he could hand it over. As he stepped into the hallway, something strange started happening. A memory one he hadn't thought about in decades crept in like a fog. The girl, the sewing machine, the silence. It pulled something loose in his mind. And suddenly, he was back in a one-bedroom walk-up in East Baltimore, 6 years old. Sitting on the floor with a broken toy while his mother worked a sewing machine with the same kind of determination he'd just seen in that little girl. Back then, they didn't call it struggling. They just called it life. His mom used to sew for a dry cleaner. She had the same calloused hands, the same look of focus, the same quiet strength that made people underestimate her until they needed her. He remembered the hum of the machine, the way she'd hum along with it to stay awake. He remembered her fingers bleeding once from a bent needle, and how she wrapped them in a napkin and just kept going. He used to beg her to stop. "Mama, you're tired," he'd say. "Just rest." But she'd always answer the same way. "If I stop, we don't eat." Martin leaned against the peeling wall of the hallway, suddenly dizzy. He hadn't thought about her in years, not since the day she died alone, in a cheap hospice room while he was out closing a real estate deal. He told himself he couldn't make it that day. Too much on his plate. Too many buildings, too many meetings, too many people who needed him. But now, looking back, he'd just gotten used to choosing power over people. And the wildest part? That little girl didn't even ask for anything. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She didn't try to win him over with tears. She just kept sewing, like the world had already made up its mind about her, and she had no time to change it. That haunted him, because once upon a time, he was that kid, watching his mother work herself to the bone, wishing anyone with power would notice. And now, here he was, the powerful one, the suit, the one who used to beg for mercy, now deciding who gets it. Martin looked down at the folder in his hand. It felt disgusting now, like evidence, like a confession. He wanted to walk away, shake it off, go back to being numb. But the crazy part? He couldn't. That little girl didn't just remind him of the past. She reminded him of the kind of man his mother raised him to never become. Martin walked back into the apartment without knocking. The girl didn't flinch. She just looked up for a second, as if to say, "You're still here?" Then went right back to sewing. He stood there, in the middle of the room, and realized how ridiculous he must have looked. A grown man in an expensive wool coat, shoes that cost more than this family's monthly groceries, standing in a room held together by hope and rust. He cleared his throat. "What's your name?" She looked up, cautiously. "Nia." He nodded, then knelt beside her. The movement felt unnatural. His knees cracked, like his body was rejecting the humility. "Well, Nia," he said slowly, "you can tell your mother she's got 2 weeks." Her hands froze on the fabric. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Not with fear, not even with relief. Just curiosity. Like she couldn't figure out why he'd changed his mind. "You mean we're not getting kicked out?" she asked, her voice even. "Not today," Martin replied. "Not this week." She blinked, then went right back to sewing. No thank you. No emotional hug. Just a quiet return to work. Like even this moment of grace was still part of the grind. Like she didn't believe in miracles. Just extensions. Martin stood back up, awkwardly brushing off his coat like it mattered. "I'll be back," he said. "But not with papers." Nia didn't answer. She was already threading another needle. As he walked out, something strange tightened in his chest. Not guilt, not pity, responsibility. Because once you've seen a child like Nia, you can't unsee her. You can't walk back into your high-rise office and pretend your late fees don't crush people. You can't sip a 12 latte knowing there's a kid patching pants for neighbors just to keep the lights on. He told her she had 2 weeks. But if he was being honest with himself, he had 2 weeks too. 2 weeks to decide who he really was. The man in the suit? Or the boy whose mama once bled at a sewing machine, praying someone would give them just a little more time. Martin didn't plan to come back, at least not so soon. But 4 days later, there he was standing outside the same peeling door, holding nothing but a plastic bag of groceries, and a question he hadn't figured out how to ask. He told himself it was just a follow-up, a routine check, a gesture maybe. But the truth? That girl had crawled into his head and refused to leave. He knocked this time, a small courtesy. Nia opened the door, still wearing that same oversized hoodie, now speckled with bits of thread. Her eyes squinted at the sunlight behind him like it had been a while since she'd seen it. "You again," she said, not smiling, not scowling, just stating a fact. Martin held out the bag. "Just thought you might need a few things." She took it without hesitation, glanced inside, then walked away. No thanks. No small talk. Just acceptance. Like being handed groceries by a millionaire in a 3-piece suit was as normal as folding laundry. Martin stepped inside again, noticing details he hadn't the first time: a towel stuffed at the bottom of the window to keep out cold air, an unplugged space heater with a frayed cord, a coffee can filled with loose change labeled "Move Out Fund" in a child's handwriting. But then something caught his eye. A half-closed door near the back. "Can I?" Nia glanced at him, then at the door. For a second, he thought she'd say no, but instead, she just nodded and returned to sorting fabric. He pushed the door open, and what he saw nearly knocked the air out of him. The room was small, maybe 8 by 8. No bed, no furniture, just clothes, dozens of them. Shirts, pants, dresses, all handmade, all hanging neatly on a line, stretched from one wall to the other. Some were stitched from old curtains, some from patched denim, but they weren't sloppy. They were designed, cut with intention, decorated with beads, patches, little painted details. There was a drawing taped to the wall, a little storefront with a sign above it that read, "Nia's Threads." Next to it, a list written in pencil. "Buy Mom a new coat. Get a real sewing machine. Learn how to make jackets. Save enough for a shop." Martin stood frozen. This wasn't just a kid making ends meet. This was a vision. She wasn't just surviving, she was building. This little girl, living in a place no adult would choose, had carved out a corner of hope and turned it into something real, something professional, something that made Martin, a man who owned half the block, feel like he hadn't built anything with this much heart in years. He walked out of the room slowly, back into the main area. "You made all of that?" he asked, still in disbelief. Nia shrugged. "Some people make music. I make clothes." That was all she said. But Martin? He heard it loud and clear. This wasn't a child looking for charity. This was a young creator waiting for the world to take her seriously. And he couldn't stop asking himself, why hadn't it? Martin couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his penthouse condo, walls of glass, heated floors, untouched art hanging in perfect symmetry. But all he saw was that tiny back room, lit by ambition and a single bare bulb. He couldn't shake it. The way her fingers moved, the way her vision covered that wall like it was already real. NIA's threads. That name echoed in his mind like a brand that already existed, not just a dream scribbled in pencil. So the next day, he did something completely out of character. He asked questions. He visited the building again, this time without a suit. Hoodie, jeans, trying to blend in or at least look less like a threat. He knocked on the neighbor's door, a middle-aged woman who'd been living there longer than most. He knew her only as Unit 3C. Today, he introduced himself by name. When he mentioned Nia, the woman's face softened. "She's the little miracle," she said. "I don't know how that girl does it." Martin leaned in. "Tell me more." The neighbor invited him in, offered him tea, and started talking. Apparently, Nia had started sewing when she was just 6. Her mom had found an old machine at a thrift store and brought it home on a whim. Nia figured out how to fix the broken parts using YouTube videos. No one taught her. No classes. No mentors. Just trial, error, and stubbornness. She'd sit for hours, the woman said. Didn't matter if her hands were raw or her back hurt. Said she liked seeing something broken turn into something new. Martin felt his throat tighten. The neighbor went on about how Nia patched everyone's clothes in the building, how she once made a jacket out of 4 different shirts for a kid who couldn't afford winter gear, how she sold handmade scrunchies to buy her mom a birthday cake last year, how she sometimes gave away work for free if someone was short on cash. "She's got this little dream," the neighbor added. "Wants to have her own boutique one day. Says she'll call it Nia's Threads." Can you believe that? Martin could. He'd seen it. But here was the part that made his gut twist. No one outside that building knew she existed. No press, no outreach, no help. Just a child with talent, buried under poverty. And maybe the saddest part? Nia had never expected to be seen. Not by schools, not by customers, definitely not by landlords. She was sewing her future with nothing but scraps, fully aware the world wasn't paying attention. Until now. Martin left that apartment stunned not just by the story, but by the silence around it. How many other girls like Nia were being ignored? How many dreams were being stitched in the dark? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? Martin didn't go back to the office the next day, or the day after that. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the same eviction file, the one with Nia's name on it, and tore it in half. Then again, until the pieces looked like confetti on the floor. And then he picked up the phone. It started with a few calls to a friend who ran a nonprofit, another who taught fashion at a design school, someone from a grant foundation he used to ignore during gala season. Every time he said the words, "There's this girl," he expected skepticism. But all it took was a photo. One picture he'd secretly snapped of Nia's sewing wall. The calendar, the rack of handmade clothes, the drawing with Nia's threads written in bold crayon. And suddenly, people were listening. A week later, Martin returned to that same apartment, this time with something he'd never carried before. Hope. Nia answered the door. Same hoodie, same smudged hands, same expression like, "What now?" Her mother was home this time, exhausted, suspicious, protective. Martin didn't blame her. He introduced himself properly, said he wasn't there as a landlord, but as someone who believed in second chances and in first chances that had never been given. Then he handed them a folder. Inside, a scholarship application, a grant proposal, a letter of recommendation he'd written himself, describing Nia as a designer born out of necessity, with more talent than half the people I've hired in my career. The mother just stared. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are you doing this?" Martin hesitated. "I think I've been collecting rent from the wrong people," he said. "It's time I started investing in someone who actually builds something." Mia didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stood there, like her brain was still stitching together what this moment even meant. He placed one last thing on the table, a brand new sewing machine, industrial grade, quiet motor, adjustable speed, still in the box. "Consider it a down payment," he said. Her mom tried to speak, failed. Nia stepped forward, ran her fingers over the machine box, then looked up at Martin for what felt like forever. And with the smallest, quietest voice, she said, "I won't waste it." That's when Martin knew. He hadn't saved anyone. He'd just finally shown up for someone who'd been saving herself all along. 6 months later, Martin sat in the front row of a community center-turned runway, a place that usually hosted bingo nights and church potlucks, now glowing under string lights and camera flashes. A hand-painted banner hung from the ceiling, proud and simple. Nia's Threads, Spring Collection. And when the first model walked out, wearing a jacket made from 3 different denim jackets and a curtain panel, Martin felt something catch in his throat. It wasn't just fashion. It was resilience, sewn into every stitch. The crowd, mostly neighbors, teachers, volunteers, erupted in applause. Some wore her designs. Others held up hand-painted signs that read, "Go Nia," and "You're the future." And at the end of the show, she walked out. Not with glitter, not with a big smile, just quiet power. Nia, now 10, in a dress she made from an old bedsheet and beaded trim, stood in the center of the runway like she owned it. And for the first time, Martin realized she did. He clapped harder than anyone, not because he was proud of what he'd done, but because he was lucky enough to witness what she was capable of. After the show, a local reporter interviewed her. The camera zoomed in as they asked, "Where did you learn all of this?" Nia looked directly into the lens. "My mom works hard. I just wanted to help her, so I figured out what I could do with what we had." That line went viral. Within days, the story exploded. Headlines everywhere. 10-year-old girl creates fashion line from scratch, sues her way out of poverty. Landlord becomes investor after seeing child's talent. Martin's inbox flooded with offers from donors, entrepreneurs, even fashion execs. But he didn't forward them. He handed every single one to Nia and her mother. Because this wasn't his story anymore. It never was. He still owned the building, but somehow, he no longer felt like the one in charge. Because real power doesn't come from money, or contracts, or titles. It comes from knowing when to stop talking and start listening. Martin Reddick, the man who used to walk into apartments with eviction papers and cold eyes, now walked out of this one with something else entirely. Perspective. And maybe that was worth more than any rent check. If this story moved you even half as much as it did, drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were Martin? Would you have walked away or stepped in? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes in second chances or needs one. We'll be back with more stories like this. Until then, remember, sometimes the most powerful people are the ones nobody's watching yet.